if an individual is asked to continue to work from home rather than return to the office, is there anything the employer should do to ensure that the working environment is a safe one? Perhaps a home working policy ought to be created and implemented if this is something that isn't normally sort of not a normal way of working for the employer.
I'd agree. And a risk assessment ought to be undertaken. Just because you're working at home doesn't mean that the employer has no responsibility for your working conditions. So the employer should satisfy itself that your working environment is suitable, that you have a proper, if you're working at a workstation, a proper setup in terms of your ergonomics to ensure that you can work safely and without risk of injury. And beyond that, the employer, I think, has a pastoral responsibility to think about the mental well-being of its workforce. And there are issues relating to isolation in the more general sense for employees who work at home and live at home and no longer have that social contact that ordinarily they might have in the workplace.
Do we think that there could be some trust and confidence type issues arising then if employers fail to manage the home working environment in a sufficient way, or they manage it so badly that it perhaps destroys the trust and confidence the employee ought to have in their employer? And we can get into arguments of whether these individuals are entitled to resign in those sorts of circumstances. Is that possible, do you think, or is that a bit too extreme? Is that going too far?
It's hard to imagine that there would be circumstances that would enable me to advise somebody to quit and claim constructive dismissal. That's never a route that we're quick to go down. And I imagine it will be only in the most extreme of cases. Perhaps one could think of a situation where an employee was in effect cut loose by the employer, go home, get on with it, and completely left to it without contact and so on. And in the right circumstances, I could see how a breakdown of trust and confidence might arise. But I would warn anybody very much against leaping to any conclusions about that without taking advice first.
And then with regards to the health and safety issues, what if an employee says, well, actually, I'm not sure my workstation is sufficiently set up? Do we think that the employer has got to send someone round to the house? Of course they can't because of social distancing and the restrictions from the government. So how does an employer physically help the employee with their workstation and making sure that the environment is a safe one? And to such a large degree, it depends on the employee communicating any concerns. Difficult to see how it could be sort of dealt with in practice, really.
Well, the employer's the one with the duty to make sure that the place of work is safe. Every employee has a duty to cooperate to ensure that health and safety is upheld, but the primary duty, I think, rests with the employer. And these days, it's not beyond the wit of a person to take a standard mobile phone and take half a dozen shots of their workstation or even a video and email or text that to the employer and say, this is the setup, how is that? And that one can't imagine that 15, 20 years ago, but now the ability of via, say, FaceTime even, for an employer to look at a workplace in real time and to discuss it with the employee in real time, it seems to me that must be appropriate in a case where, as you say, the employer can't otherwise get to see the setup at home.
Yeah, and I can see it being very important that employees who perhaps suffer from a disability and have had adjustments and auxiliary aids provided within the office and are suddenly then asked to work from home, that those disabled members of staff ought to really be contacting their employers to say, look, I need some equipment here, or I need some reasonable adjustments to be made to enable me to work safely from home. So I would think that unions will have to keep a close eye on anyone that's in that situation and make sure that they're working in a safe environment for them, taking into account the effects of their disability.
Yes, and the employer's responsibility to make reasonable adjustments will continue in full force, despite the fact that the employee is no longer in the workplace.